I'm Christopher Lydon, and this is Open Source, unearthing a model writer for an anxious America. Dwight Macdonald was his own eccentric voice through the Cold War politics and culture of the 1950s and 60s. He was a peacenik at heart, otherwise unpredictable, a New York intellectual of his own school. So in this podcast, we're just reading Dwight Macdonald aloud with John Summers, who has edited a collection he calls Atrocities of the Mind, Essays on Violence and Politics in the American Century, from the University of Chicago Press. The premise in our conversation, John, is that a certain urgent music in Dwight Macdonald's prose still sounds clearly enough for a world that has nobody quite like his range today. You start. The basics, in brief. Who was Dwight Macdonald? The pedigreed populist, sometime Trotskyite, hard left, who came to call himself a conservative anarchist. Sketch him.
Thanks, Chris. He was, first of all, the child of Timothy Macdonald, who was a Manhattan attorney and a descendant of the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So Macdonald had a pedigree is the right word, and his mother was Alice. Macdonald referred to himself as a real New Yorker. He had the New York accent and sometimes liked to think that America stopped west of the Hudson. He was one of those, he said this as he said many things in a kind of self-critical or joshing sense. He was a very lighthearted guy, and he was raised in Manhattan. His parents sent him to Phillips Exeter Academy.
The best of the best.
Yeah, which he talked about as his first teacher, this institution, in which he flourished as a poet and as a writer. Literature was his main preoccupation. Literature and film. He saw his first movie on the Jersey Shore when he was 13 years old. He graduated as class poet from Phillips Exeter and then went to Yale.
And stayed interesting. Went to work for Henry Luce in that era when people like John Kenneth Galbraith, James Agee, and other interesting unconventional writers got their start.
Yes. After he graduated from Yale, he took a job with Luce. But I should say before that, he decided that he was going to be a businessman. That's originally what he wanted to do. He was going to make a lot of money. So he worked for R.H. Macy's in the late 20s for 6 months and dropped out of the training program. And instead of becoming a businessman, he had an opportunity through a Yale classmate to join the new publication called Fortune, which was spectacularly ill-timed magazine because it began within months of the Great Depression, of the crash.
Can I just note, there's a progress here, a pilgrim's progress looking for himself, and it stays with him, seems to me, deep into his writing life. But the point I want to just plunge into is that it seems to me Dwight Macdonald becomes our American version of Orwell, which is to say the stylish prose guy that we still love for a mix of both affection and asperity he brought to looking at his country. He's not the Orwell of 1984. He's the Orwell of The Lion and the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius, which Orwell wrote in 1941 at the start of World War II. It began, unforgettably, he says, "As I write, highly civilized human beings are flying overhead trying to kill me." He said England was the most class-ridden country under the sun, a land of snobbery and privilege, ruled largely by the old and silly. It's a family with the wrong members in control. Listen to the echo here. Dwight Macdonald, on returning to New York in 1957 after a year in Europe, he writes, "We are an unhappy people, a people without style, without a sense of what is humanly satisfying. Our values are not anchored securely, not in the past, which is to say tradition, and not in the present, meaning community. There's a terrible shapelessness about American life. These prosperous Americans look more tense and joyless than the people in the poorest quarters of Florence. Even the English have more joie de vivre. We have more of everything a human being can conceivably and inconceivably want, yet we are," he said, "not happy. Why not?" is always his nagging question. And especially, why are we so violent? And who can we hold responsible?
I think you've given his answer in the last part of what you said, is because we are so violent, because the nation at this point, America is 1957, after he comes back from England, is basically still on war footing. Macdonald was very interested in this concept called the permanent war economy. He was very critical of the New Deal for not solving the Depression. The only thing that solved the Depression was war, what was called military Keynesianism. And the nation remained on edge in the Cold War period. The mass consumption economy predicated on winning the Cold War, and a sense that fluorescent lights and new refrigerators weren't going to do it. He talked about consumerism as a kind of narcotic.
Yeah.
That doesn't exactly put you to sleep, but puts you on edge.
So for him, it becomes a series of questions. He writes, why is it things always seem to go against us? How were we caught? How has it now happened to all of us? So that ours has become, in a scant 2 years, a nation hated and feared and despised in the way Hitler's Germany and Stalin's Russia were. In what way were we trapped? Where our mistake? How might all these things have been different if only we had done otherwise, if only we had known? How did this all sink so swift away? Sounds to me like 2026. He wrote that in Vietnam wartime, 1967. For me, the pleasure of Dwight Macdonald is that he feels so alive in our world, yours and mine.
Yeah, I think he does. And these kind of questions, which, as you read them, are rhetorical because he's not fully trying to answer them, but he's posing them, reminds me of another Orwell essay, which I thought you were going to discuss, called In Front of Your Nose, where Orwell says famously that the most difficult thing in the world is to recognize what's right under your nose. And I think this speaks to Macdonald's sensibility. He's the guy who is reading the magazines, he's reading the newspapers, he's talking to a lot of people, and he's trying to figure out, what he thinks about things, what is happening. And he approaches political questions and ethical questions not as a geostrategist or a movement leader, or at least in the latter part of his career, not as a kind of ideological figure, and still less as an academic or government expert, but from the standpoint of an informed citizen.
Yeah. And human being. I mean, he's obviously trying to figure out his politics. At some point, he writes that he was moving from liberal to radical to tepid communist to ardent anti-Stalinist, and on it goes. There's the cultural piece, too. Can you see the path in hindsight?
Yes, he has a wonderful essay in the book called Politics Past. It's one of the great political autobiographies, I think, that has been written in the 20th century. It's very long and it's very searching. It's very fair and very honest, as he always tries to be, in which he sort of makes fun of himself. It's published in 1957 as the lead essay in a collection of essays called Memoirs of a Revolutionist. It looks back on his career in the 30s as a tepid communist fellow traveler at first, then as a Trotskyist, then as a pacifist and anarchist, then as a liberal anti-Stalinist, and thinks he's a little bit crazy. He thinks that the gap between the kind of range and depth and passion of his thinking and the kind of thinking of his colleagues was so out of proportion to any action they took or could have taken. And yet, that essay, Politics Past, comes about 2/3 of the way through this book, Atrocities of the Mind. And when he hangs up politics and he says, I'm sort of done with all this. He says, I now think the only kind of person that has a duty to interest himself in politics is a politician. Almost as soon as he finished writing, he's out in front of the Waldorf Astoria in New York with the War Resisters League, and he's the oldest person on the picket line. So he was always, I think he was a seeker.
Definitely. I'm glad
willing
you say
to
that.
change his mind. You might think, well, of course, if facts change, one must change your mind. That's true enough. But if the things that come in front of your nose, you should change with them. But that was a trait of his personality that caused enormous criticism, that he was not a serious person.
He took on a challenge to figure it all out in a way. It's a kind of enviable but incredibly challenging role he's given himself, to be philosophical and literary and political all at once. But let me just note, Dwight Macdonald was not shy or at all embarrassed by a streak of genuine reverence that he had, writing about Mahatma Gandhi, for example, or closer to home, Dorothy Day, who opened a soup kitchen in Manhattan in the 1930s, the Depression, and put out a newspaper called The Catholic Worker for more than 50,000 subscribers, my parents among them. I'd like to dwell on that for a sec. He wrote Politically, the Catholic workers are hard to classify. This is 1952. They are for the poor and against the rich, so the capitalists call them communists. They believe in private property and don't believe in class struggle, so the communists call them capitalists. And they are hostile to war and to the state, so both capitalists and communists consider them crackpots. He writes, people who try to live their everyday lives according to an ideal are likely to make fools of themselves, which some critics think is just what the Catholic workers have been doing for nearly 20 years. Others, more charitable, hold that there are two differences between the Catholic workers' folly and plain foolishness. One is that theirs is premeditated. They are, so to speak, fools on principle. Let us be fools for Christ, Miss Day says. Let us recklessly act out our vision, even if we shall almost surely fail. For what the world calls failure is often, from a Christian viewpoint, success.
Yes, that's very beautiful and not a bad self-description, with some modifications of MacDonald's view of what he was up to.
Interesting.
He was a creature of magazines. He never wrote a proper book, and he was one of the great American essayists.
Gandhi, as I mentioned, also got an essay of great praise from George Orwell, too. Dwight Macdonald wrote that Gandhi was the last political leader in the world who was a person, not a mask or a radio voice or an institution, the last on a human scale, the last for whom Dwight Macdonald felt neither fear nor contempt nor indifference, but interest and affection. He was dear to me. I realize it now better than I did when he was alive, for all kinds of reasons. He believed in love, gentleness, persuasion, simplicity of manners, and he came closer to living up to those beliefs than most people I know. He was dear to me, MacDonald says, because he had no respect for railroads, assembly belt production, and other knickknacks of liberalistic progress. Also because he was clever, humorous, lively, hard-headed, and he never made speeches about fascism, democracy, the common man, or world government. And finally, because he was a good man, by which I mean not only good, but also man.
Yes, and he was murdered, and he was assassinated, which is the occasion for the piece.
Yeah.
Want to linger a little bit on this changing of mind.
Sure.
So in these gyrations of political affiliation from Trotskyism to conservative anarchism and pacifism and anarchism in between, he did take a lot of grief from a lot of his contemporaries for changing his mind. And he was often not taken very seriously. And yet it's this very quality, I think, of MacDonald writing essays, which are by their own nature unpredictable. When you begin an essay, a good essay, you don't really know where it's going to end. It's a kind of unpredictable genre. When you read these essays, you're reading someone who is not exactly thinking out loud off the cuff, but trying to convince himself what he thinks.
Right.
He had this quality of lightheartedness and self-irony.
Yes.
That's very rare in a political writer, extremely rare.
It's a performance of sorts.
Yes, it is. He was the guy at the cocktail party who was jabbing his FDR cigarette holder at someone, making a passionate argument in one corner, and then going to the other corner later on after he has a few more drinks and making the opposite argument to someone, because he's using the conversational medium to teach himself what he thinks. And so, as I say, he got a lot of grief for this. And if I may, I want to read a description of him by Mary McCarthy, who is his good friend.
Please do. I was just thinking, he was in the company of the Mary McCarthys of that era.
Absolutely.
Norman Mailer.
Yes, he was very widely known. He was a kind of staple of intellectual journalism or literary journalism and film criticism from the late 30s to the 70s. So he was a name that lots of people recognized. So in Mary McCarthy's novel, The Oasis novella, she calls him MacDougall McDermott. And she says the following about him. Tall, red-bearded, gregarious, susceptible to a liver complaint, puritanical, disputatious, hard-working, monogamous, a good father and a good friend, he had suffered all of his life from a vague sense that he was somehow crass, that he did not belong by natural endowment to that world of the spirit which his intellect told him was the highest habitation of man. Had he not seen a poem, he would have scoffed at the idea of poetry. And had the idea of poetry not been presented to him, he would have scoffed at a poem. This is one of the gentler things that was said about it. He did not like this portrait, by the way, at all. He thought it was a kind of betrayal. But he had a marvelous capacity for not holding grudges and not incurring grudges at the same time.
What would he have added or stricken from that sketch?
Well, he probably would have pointed out that he was class poet at Phillips Exeter, so it's a little bit unfair. But he was, of course, also a polemicist. He could be quite brutal in his essays and out of his ethic of direct, honest, conversational prose. But somehow he managed not to make a lot of enemies in this period.
Norman Mailer said something to that effect, that you could disagree with him on all sorts of things, but you never doubted his fundamental honesty.
That's right. His moral honesty.
Yes, it's a high compliment.
And Hannah Arendt said the same thing.
That's high praise from very critical minds.
They were very good friends. But to my mind, the person who said it best was Saul Bellow in a passage in Humboldt's Gift, which I must say I was not allowed to include in my introduction to this volume by Chicago because times being what they are, we're, I guess, slightly more sensitive. But it's the best, I think.
Please.
Portrait of the reception of Macdonald by fellow New York intellectuals. So this is a passage from Saul Bellow's Humboldt's Gift in which Macdonald is Orlando Huggins. He knew how to carry on a conversation at a noisy cocktail party. Din and drink stimulated him. He was not perhaps too clear in the head, but the actual head I had always appreciated. It was long and high, banked with well-brushed silver hair, the uneven ends of long strands giving a spiky effect at the back. Over his tall man's belly was a shirt of Marymount stripes, broad crimson and diabolical purple, like the ribbons of the reveller's maypole. It came back to me that more than 20 years ago I had found myself at a beach party in Montauk on Long Island, where Huggins, naked at one end of the log, discussed the Army McCarthy hearings with a lady sitting naked and astride opposite him. Huggins was speaking with a cigarette holder in his teeth, and his penis, which lay before him on the water-smooth wood, expressed all the fluctuations of his interest. And while he was puffing and giving his views in a neighing stammer, his genital went back and forth like the slide of a trombone. You could never feel unfriendly toward a man of whom you kept such a memory.
It's Saul Bellow on the fictionalized Dwight Macdonald.
That's right.
Here we are deep in Trump time, late in Trump time, I think. And I just keep pushing. We had anybody out there, especially in the Times or on television, that sounded anything like as awake and critical as Dwight Macdonald does. Let me read a short bit of an essay he called The Bomb. He wrote it in 1945. I mean, Hiroshima was barely cool by then. It seems fitting that the bomb was not developed by any of the totalitarian powers, where the political atmosphere might at first glance seem to be more suited to it, but by the two democracies, the last major powers to continue to pay at least ideological respect to the humanitarian democratic tradition. It also seems fitting that the heads of these governments, by the time the bomb exploded, were not Roosevelt and Churchill, figures of a certain historical and personal stature, but Attlee and Truman, both colorless mediocrities. Average men elevated to their positions by the mechanics of the system. All of this emphasizes that perfect automatism, that absolute lack of human consciousness or aims which our society is rapidly achieving. As a pile of uranium, once the elements have been brought together, inexorably runs through a series of chain reactions until the final explosion takes place, so the elements of our society act and react regardless of ideologies or personalities until the bomb explodes over Hiroshima. The more commonplace the personalities and senseless the institutions, the more grandiose the destruction. It is Götterdämmerung, twilight of the gods, without the gods.
Yes, the key word that leaped out to me in that passage is automatism, which was his focus in his essays, the first of which is called The Responsibility of Peoples, which is about the final solution, when it was still called the final solution.
The extermination of German Jews.
Before it was called the Holocaust. Macdonald was the first American writer or intellectual of any stature to write about this subject. It was not widely acknowledged or discussed until the early 60s with Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, which is a book that he defended very vigorously. But for a long time, MacDonald had written the only essay on this subject. And one of the phenomena that he identifies is this sense that society has taken on this quality of mechanical automatism, that it just reproduces itself, regardless of human will, regardless of human volition. And so in that essay, he's talking about problems of powerlessness. He says something to the effect of never in centuries has the individual been so powerless. And yet at the same time, so much horror has been done in the name of the individual by the state. So that is a through line through these essays that goes to Vietnam, of course, as well, where he thinks that the Vietnam War is kind of grinding on as an impersonal mechanism. No one can sort of stop it. No one knows what it's for, with death, destruction, and this American faith in military technology. You know, we're very good at military technology, very bad at politics.
Yes. Dwight Macdonald had a sort of midwife's role in the birth of anti-poverty programs in America after the early 60s. President Kennedy had not read the book by Michael Harrington called The Other America about the poverty that afflicted 1 in 4 Americans in that era. What President Kennedy did read was Dwight Macdonald's New Yorker review of that book. And then it seemed that everybody read it. The problem is obvious, Dwight Macdonald summed it up. The persistence of mass poverty in a prosperous country. The solution is also obvious, to provide, out of taxes, the kind of subsidies that have always been given to the public schools, not to mention the police and fire departments and the post office, subsidies that would raise incomes above the poverty level so that every citizen could feel he is indeed such. Civis Romanus sum, meaning I am a Roman citizen in Latin, was what St. Paul cried when he was threatened with flogging, and as a result, he was not flogged. Until our poor can be proud to say Civis Americanus sum, I'm an American. Until the act of justice that would make this possible has been performed by the 3/4 of Americans who are not poor, until then, the shame of the other America will continue.
Yes, President Kennedy read Macdonald's review in The New Yorker, which was at that time the longest review The New Yorker had ever published, and asked his Walter Heller, who was the chairman of his Council of Economic Advisors, to do something about this. And policy was beginning to be developed when Kennedy was killed, and Lyndon Johnson then at his State of the Union address a few months later declared war on poverty. So it was the most consequential essay he ever published. Also an example of his willingness and his disarming style of telling you that he's changed his mind. At the beginning of this essay, he says, well, I didn't think we had mass poverty anymore. I thought it was pretty much over because John Kenneth Galbraith in the Affluent Society told me so. But Galbraith, it turns out, was wrong. This essay, by the way, this review essay, appeared a year after Michael Harrington's Other America. The book was not widely reviewed and probably would have just never been heard of without this essay. So it was a very important intervention. He does say later then, after the war on poverty begins, the Great Society begins, that it reminds him of the New Deal. The money is too miserly. It's not going to lift people out of poverty. In fact, it's going to create a permanent underclass that's going to be ripe for victim blaming. And so in a subsequent piece, he comes out more fully for universal basic income as an alternative to the welfare programs that had begun. So again, he's always, drawing conclusions, looking at new realities, new facts, listening to new people, and revising himself constantly. I've never read a book, much less edited a book of essays, of other people's essays, in which there are so many footnotes, block footnotes, in which the author is criticizing himself. But in almost every essay, there's a long footnote where Macdonald looks back on the essay as he'd originally published it and says, no, that was all wrong. How could I possibly thought such a thing? But, he leaves it in and then leaves the criticism in. It's an underlying confidence in the work. And it's a pleasure to read, not because you're getting gospel or you're getting ideology, but because you're being encouraged to think with him and to think in a way that encourages you to understand your own mind. It's a very rare quality to have, especially in political writing.
and rarer now than it was then. I mean, it was not all cocktail parties, and there's something very serious going on. As you read that, I was just thinking, we need more essayists. This combination of the personal and the public and the inquiry and conversation and an underlying argument, it's great stuff. John, I remember reading that review in the New Yorker. I also remember reading him in Esquire. I never did really get into his own magazine called Politics.
So Macdonald became unhappy with Fortune magazine. This was in the middle of the Depression and his position there, and decided to test the limits of the editorial freedom that Henry Luce, the publisher, was liable to afford his writers. A remarkable stable of writers that he had collected at this magazine, and wrote a piece about U.S. Steel, in which he decided he would preface with a quotation from Lenin. That was removed. The essay was heavily censored, and Macdonald quit. He taunted and dared them to censor him, and they did, and then he quit. He left a very lucrative job in the middle of the Depression, right on the cusp of the Roosevelt recession in 1937, to go to Partisan Review. New magazine that had started up. And this was his, he later said, was his second teacher after Phillips Exeter Academy was Partisan Review. And he was a very important part of reviving that magazine, which combined radical politics and modernist literature. And then in 1943, he decided that he was too much at odds with his co-editors over World War II, which he opposed, and quit, took the mailing list with him, and started his own magazine called Politics.
Remind us why he opposed World War II.
Well, he thought that, as many Marxists did, that World War II was just another imperial war, and no good was going to come from it, and that to the extent that the United States persisted or got into the war in the first place, would introduce fascism at home. And later he said that, he was wrong about World War II, but it was a very productive mistake because it allowed him to focus on the sheer malevolence of and brutality with which the war was waged. Most people forget this now, but in the early part of the war, there were widespread assurances from U.S. political class and military class that this would be over soon. There wouldn't be much death.
Still hear things like that.
Still do things like this, but it turned out not to be the case. It turned out to be, turned out to be horrible. And so he decided that he was going to start his own magazine with his wife, Nancy. He had his savings from Fortune, and his wife, Nancy, had a trust fund.
He said, why am I doing this? Why can't I do this? Because not least his wife had a trust fund.
Yes, and she was the business manager of Partisan Review, and it doesn't get enough attention, but was a very important part in radicalizing him in the first place in the 30s. But what I want to put across is this sense of a man who is bothered by his conscience and so driven by his sense of principle to get it right that he leaves in the middle of the Depression a very lucrative job and sacrifices this career to start a small magazine that who knows what prospects. It turns out that many historians think it's the best small magazine of the 20th century. It was immensely influential, this magazine. It ran from 1943 to 1948. Although in the later years, it was somewhat less frequent. It was basically a one-man show.
What did it influence? And what impact did it have on the worst of all wars?
Well, it was the only publication that was calling attention to the brutality of the war.
Right.
And this is where a number of the pieces in the beginning of this book originally appeared, including the responsibility of peoples, which is the most important of the essays. It comes first. Another essay called My Favorite General, which is
George
about
Patton.
which is about George Patton. And
Old blood and guts.
the phrase atrocities of the mind comes from a line in Macdonald's essay about Patton, in which he's describing Patton's speech to his Third Army the day before D-Day, this kind of famous, coarse, brutal, vicious speech that Patton gave.
Patton, who had famously slapped an enlisted man
Yes.
for complaining that he was troubled by the war.
Yes. Macdonald thinks that the war even brutalized Patton's personality. There's a piece in here about how to kill, in which Macdonald reads an army manual about various ways of killing another man hand to hand. This magazine was his primary outlet at the time. It also published Simone Weil's essay on the Iliad for the first time in translation, and Bruno Bettelheim's essay about the extermination camps. It was, at certain points, MacDonald said, a transplanted spore of European resistance culture. So it was very influential. C. Wright Mills, Hans Gerth introduced Max Weber in the magazine. One could go on. Toward the end of the 40s, MacDonald was really burned out. He was very depressed. The Cold War was starting. None of his hopes panned out, and shut the magazine and took a job at the New Yorker as a staff writer.
You say the most important essay in the book is one titled The Responsibility of Peoples. Sum up that wisdom.
MacDonald, as I said, opposed the war, which he later called a mistake, but it did open up for him a very bracing and important critique of the means by which both sides waged World War II. He points out that Roosevelt's policy of unconditional surrender was the justification for saturation bombing of Germany and Japan, and was collective punishment of the Japanese and German people. And he points out that a logical extension of the policy would hold the entire American people responsible for the mass murder of German civilians and the internment of Japanese American citizens. So he's very much against this idea that justifying both means and ends of the war in terms of collective responsibility. And at the end of the essay, he draws a very stark conclusion. And if I may, I'll just read a passage
Please.
From the end of Responsibility of Peoples. He says, "Not for many centuries have individuals been at once so powerless to influence what is done by the national collectivities to which they belong, and at the same time so generally held responsible for what is done by those collectivities. Where can common peoples look for relief from this intolerable, agonizing contradiction?" Well, not to any other collectivity, not to the labor movement, he goes on to say at this conclusion. But he does say something that strikes home in 2026, I think, that we could all take instruction from. He says, "We must look both more widely and more deeply for relief from the dilemma of increasing political impotence accompanied by increasing political responsibility. We must look to our essential humanity and to a more sensitive and passionate respect for our own and other people's humanity." One of the last comments that has been recorded and broadcast by Noam Chomsky, when he's asked this question, what can we do, which is a very reasonable question once the critique is accepted. It was from a few years ago. And he says, his wave of the hand, and he says, "Remember your humanity, forget the rest." Same thing that MacDonald is saying. And Chomsky was a big admirer of Dwight Macdonald. And this essay in particular was very important for Chomsky when Chomsky was a college student and read it, and very deeply influenced Chomsky's own essay called The Responsibility of Intellectuals in the 60s, which in turn has influenced generations of young people. So American radical thought has always had this problem of transmitting itself generation to generation, because we've not had, at least compared to the Europeans, large organizations devoted to doing so. We've had coalitions, we've had single issues, but we've had a very difficult time transmitting radical thought through the generations. And now that the universities are shrinking and the humanities are shrinking, it's especially important to try to find the voices that can speak to us and reconstruct these traditions on our own.
Let me read one paragraph which, to me, embodies the virtues of the essay method, but it also has this strand of hating war. War is the problem. It begins with a citation of a Nathaniel Hawthorne letter, his last letter, written during the Civil War, and it contained this Delphic warning, MacDonald said. Here's Hawthorne. "You will live to see the Americans another people than they have hitherto been." In his cool way, MacDonald observes, Hawthorne understood the Civil War's historical meaning more realistically than optimistic ideologues like Emerson and Whitman. For Hawthorne, he said, was right, that war did change Americans and not for the better. He's writing in 1967, and he asks, what can be expected then from our present burlesque in Vietnam, which lacks both political rationality and moral justification, defective in both, as the Civil War may seem to us now as we look back on its causes and its consequences. At that time, many Americans, and those not the worst or the least, believed in them. Almost no one seriously believes in this war, Vietnam, including many who feel obliged to support it in public. This war, which is not even a war legally, but an end run around the Constitution, a shady maneuver by a flim-flam artist who conned the Senate on false grounds of national emergency into surrendering to him via the Tonkin Gulf Resolution war-making powers he is making more than the most of. There's nothing worse than war, in short.
Nothing worse than violence, I would say. Although I think Macdonald is perhaps not at his best in that passage. He knows very well that the invasion of Vietnam started in 1954. It didn't start with the Gulf of Tonkin, although it massively escalated. And the aggression really began in 1961 with John F. Kennedy. I raise this because the question is, does the war change the national character? The Hawthorne quote seems to suggest that it does, but it almost begs the question, actually. Is the American character violent to begin with, as D.H. Lawrence famously said? The essential American soul is hard, isolate, stoic, and a killer. It has never yet melted. Lawrence says this in Studies in Classical American Literature on a famous essay about Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking novels. To some extent, it's not terribly important which comes first, but it's not important in the sense of what war and extreme violence does to individuals, for sure. And Macdonald's primary impetus of his writing, his political writing, I think, and after he gives up the Trotskyist world revolutions coming, is the preservation of the individual personality, the individual human emotion. And again, to the sophisticated New York intellectual crowd, this was just, silly stuff to some extent. James Cannon, who was Trotsky's lieutenant, called him flighty Dwighty. C. Wright Mills, a very important sociologist in the period, called him the Peter Pan of the American left.
Let me say, that's cruel, but it's also missing the point entirely, is it not?
Well, the point is that, for Mills, social change happens through social movements, large-scale social movements. For Cannon, it was going to happen through the worldwide proletarian revolution, for Cannon and for Trotsky. For Macdonald, he gives up on these things. And the question is where to go. After he starts The New Yorker, he starts writing cultural criticism. And as I said before, doesn't think anyone has a duty to interest themselves in politics. But the cultural criticism is still framed around the same tension between the integrity of the individual personality and freedom and dignity and totalitarianism, whether it's in culture or whether it's in politics.
Mid-cult and mass cult were the two words that he coined to describe the cultural confusion. Is there a way to sum that up and relate it to the violent stuff?
Well, it's a kind of regimentation and barbarism in culture. Those who know little about Macdonald's cultural criticism find him exceedingly easy to caricature. And there are important criticisms to be made of these essays, this strain of his thought, this other side of his thought, one might say. But they're very stimulating and I think very important, especially today. So the way that culture and violence show up in this collection, Atrocities of the Mind, is in a couple of pieces that he has on film. As I said earlier, Macdonald was a film aficionado. He shared this with James Agee and with C. Wright Mills, as a matter of fact, and wrote a lot of film criticism. In fact, he wrote a column for Esquire in the 60s on film. And in a piece that's reproduced here about Alfred Hitchcock, who he doesn't like at all, he says the following about Psycho, the shower scene. I'm against censorship on principle, but this killing in the shower makes me wonder. And not because of the nudity. I favor more nudity in films. Also more eroticism and sensuality. It is the sadism that bothers me. Our censors have the opposite view. They see nothing wrong in showing in intimate, suggestive detail a helpless woman being stabbed to death. But had Mr. Hitchcock ventured to show one of Janet Leigh's nipples, that would have been a serious offense against morals and decency. Yes to violence, no to sex. Does that not sum up the enduring American soul? I mean, the hypocrisy makes no sense on the face of it. It requires, explanation. And there are other essays in here as well about Hiroshima on film and about Roman Polanski's film Repulsion. Macdonald takes the position, which is somewhat old-fashioned, I guess, that at this point that people have a right to die maybe without being photographed. That this inundation of images of the death camps, for example, in Hiroshima films, it just desensitizes people to the horror. And that art, not mass cult or mid cult, but art can perform a mediating function where the violence is off stage and yet more powerful. Cinematic naturalism, literary naturalism, such as, for example, John Hersey's essay in the New Yorker on Hiroshima, he thinks is counterproductive.
Yeah, he called it denaturalized naturalism. He didn't approve of that.
He didn't.
Very popular piece.
Okay.
I want to go back just to the essay that began with the Hawthorne letter, and it's about war in general and Vietnam in particular. Here's Macdonald. The Civil War was a tragedy. The Vietnam non-war is an accident that has turned into a disaster. Was it not so increasingly destructive of lives and many other human things, such as the national identity Hawthorne worried about, it would be slapstick comedy, like slipping on a banana peel, if one can imagine a whole nation taking a pratfall. Coming toward an end, John, where can we hear that voice today? An age of more and more consternation about a war with Iran that stops on a Thursday, begins on a Tuesday, goes round the barn, makes no sense to almost anybody. Where are we and where?
Well, let's not judge these things too narrowly. I mean, we won the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was primarily designed to make sure that there was never going to be another Cuba. That's why John F. Kennedy dramatically accelerated the aggression in 1961 and 1962. That there can never be a genuinely neutral, independent state that was neither communist nor capitalist. And to the extent that we destroyed that country, we made sure that everyone else got the message.
That's your reading.
Well, we know what happened to Vietnam. I mean, we know that there could be no third way. One way of putting the critique of American foreign policy is you're either friend or foe. And we will withdraw, we give you a political settlement as long as we have military hegemony. I mean, this has basically been our position, since Korea. And there can be no third way. So Iran, are we winning? Are we losing the Iran war? Well, we may not win or lose in terms of whatever as you say, the objectives are on any given day. But what we are telling the world is what we can do and what we will do. There's not just the violence, there's the constant threat of violence. I think that's very important.
The world is not persuaded, and I think most Americans clearly are not persuaded.
By what?
By the logic of off and on violence to remind the world that we're in charge.
Who's not persuaded by that?
Who is? I don't know anybody who's persuaded that this is working in any American...
Well, again, it depends on what you mean by, what's the ultimate objective here? I mean, the whole world has been nuclear hostages now for a long time. I mean, this is the background that we don't like to talk about very much, but, the world can blow up any time. And the question is, who's going to do it? And what's the threat? And how far will American leaders go? And we know they will go quite far, gone farther than anyone else has gone. So there is something being accomplished by the destruction, even if it's not what the pundits and the cognoscenti say.
What would Dwight Macdonald say is being accomplished?
He might not think ultimately anything is being accomplished, but in terms of what the American leadership wants to do, which is to flex force and to show willingness to use it, then, they've proven that they'll do it. And that has effects. It had effects. The neutralist movement in world affairs died. Do you want to try to become a neutral? Do you want to steer between the Soviet Union and the United States? Look what we'll do to you, even if we ultimately withdraw.
I want to hear the Dwight Macdonald critique and argument against it, the outrage, the embarrassment that we don't hear almost any place in America in 2026.
Macdonald died in 1982, and at the time he was hailed as one of the great American essayists of the 20th century. What's happened to the essay? There are essays on Substack, which is, I think, a pretty interesting independent platform. But, I think the sad truth is that the country is a lot dumber than that generation. That generation was the best educated generation in American history. And the level of collective intelligence is much lower. And one of the interesting pleasures, for me at least, in reading the Atrocities of the Mind is all these references to the Greeks and to the Romans and to the Bible and this kind of background erudition that Macdonald doesn't put in your face, but informs his criticism. And we don't really have that much anymore. We react instantly. Essays are 1,500 words now rather than 3,000 or 4,000.
We don't hear people talking about, did you read that essay or did you catch that critique? I don't know where I'd look for it today.
Yes, things are quite fractured.
We do have a lot of Substacks. We have a lot of magazines, N+1, for example, which I think is aspiring to the standing of Dwight Macdonald, the voice, the independence. Is that hopeful?
Perhaps, yes. It's good it exists, and other magazines like it exist. The Drift is a good magazine, and it has a critique of mass culture, for which it gets pummeled as elitists. But one thing that's happened is there is a chill, there is a censorship in the air now that there wasn't then. I think people are a lot more afraid to say what they really think, and therefore don't know what they really think as much. Macdonald took a lot of risks, and within his community, he took a lot of jibes, as I've mentioned, but ultimately was respected for his honesty. It's much harder to get that kind of reception now. There's no question that Macdonald would have been writing about Gaza and writing about it in terms of the mass victimization. He was extremely sensitive to mass victimization, and he would have talked about the concept of collective guilt, which is really important part of this book and an important part of the responsibility of peoples, which is the first essay. And if readers pick up this book and read no other essay, I would hope that they would read the first one, Responsibility of Peoples, to talk about the ironies and the tragic ironies of attributing collective guilt and therefore collective punishment.
And collective habits.
Yes, but everyone lines up on one side or another instantly, even though both sides use the concept of collective guilt and collective punishment. So it requires a lot more courage, I think. It also requires money. We're a much less equal society. There was a very robust, strong middle class in mid-century America that is pretty much gone now. Highly educated. They read books, lots of magazines. So it is different now. It does require more courage. It requires also, in terms of the work that Macdonald is writing, a kind of inner spaciousness that he got from literature and poetry. I mean, he started out and wanted to be a writer as a literary man. And with the decline of the humanities today, it's less in evidence. However, I don't want to be too dour about the situation, except to say that the book it's a beautiful kind of example of the kind of work that can be done.
I was going to say, and let me conclude, John, simply, all the more reason to congratulate you, thank you for this collection, this book, Atrocities of the Mind, Dwight Macdonald's essays on violence and politics in the American century. You're resetting a standard, or at least reminding us of a standard that might help a lot, even now.
Thank you. I think it helped me to clarify my own thinking about contemporary issues.
Thank you, John Summers. I should also mention the foreword by our friend Andrew Basevich, Atrocities of the Mind. Thank you, John Summers, and thank you, Dwight Macdonald.
Thank you.
John Summers is an independent historian whose main project underway is a biography of the radical American sociologist C. Wright Mills. Here at Open Source, we count on listener support. If you haven't done your part yet, please go to radioopensource.org/donate and pitch in to keep the world's first and longest running podcast going strong. And leave a comment on what you're hearing. We're happy to be founding members of Hub and Spoke, a Boston-based collective of independent voices in podcasting. Check the range of our interests, from technology to politics to history to art, at hubspokeaudio.org. You'll be glad you did, and thank you.